The ring was on Cecilia's finger when she came down to breakfast. It was not a subtle ring. It was a sapphire the size of a sparrow's eye, set in gold that had been in the Ashworth family for 4 generations, and it caught the morning light from the east-facing windows of Hartfield House with the aggressive sparkle of something that wanted very much to be noticed. Margaret Hartley noticed it immediately. She noticed it because she had spent the past 6 weeks imagining that ring on her own hand in the particular way that a woman imagines something she has been led to believe is coming, not with certainty exactly, but with the careful, measured hope of someone who has been given every reason to expect it and no reason to doubt. She was standing at the sideboard when Cecilia entered, pouring tea from the silver pot that their mother considered essential for any morning that might involve conversation of significance. The tea was Darjeeling, imported at considerable expense, and Margaret had been drinking it without tasting it, because her mind was occupied with the question of whether the Duke of Ashworth would call today, as he had called every day for the past 3 weeks, and whether today might be the day the question she had been waiting for would finally arrive. Cecilia sat down at the table. She reached for the toast rack with her left hand, and the sapphire blazed. Margaret set down the teapot. She set it down carefully, the way one sets down something fragile when one's hands have suddenly become unreliable. She looked at the ring. She looked at her sister. She looked at Cecilia's face, which was arranged in the particular expression of a woman who is attempting to appear casual about something she is deeply pleased about, and who is failing at the attempt because her eyes kept darting to Margaret's face to gauge the reaction. "That ring," Margaret said. Her voice came out very even, surprisingly even, considering. "Yes," Cecilia said. She held up her hand, turning it slightly so the sapphire caught another angle of light. "The Duke proposed last night, after dinner, in the garden." She paused. "He asked Papa first, of course. Papa gave his blessing." Margaret stood very still at the sideboard. The Darjeeling cooled in its cup. The morning light continued to stream through the east-facing windows with the cheerful indifference of light that does not know it is illuminating a catastrophe. "Last night," Margaret repeated, "after dinner." "Yes, while you were reading in your room. He stayed late. You know how he and Papa talk. And then he asked me to walk in the garden, and he proposed by the sundial." Cecilia smiled. It was a real smile, bright and unguarded, and it made Margaret's chest hurt in a way that was physical, specific, and entirely new. "He said he had been thinking about it for weeks." Weeks. Margaret had been receiving the Duke of Ashworth in the morning room for 3 weeks. She had poured his tea. She had discussed poetry with him. He preferred Pope, she preferred Cowper. They had agreed to disagree with the kind of intellectual pleasure that came from finding someone who could hold their own in an argument. She had walked with him in the garden, the same garden, presumably, where he had proposed to Cecilia, and they had talked about estate management and tenant relations and the particular challenges of managing a household during wartime, subjects that most men considered inappropriate for women and that the Duke had discussed with her as though her opinions were not merely welcome but necessary. She had, in the careful and measured way that Margaret Hartley did everything, allowed herself to believe that these visits were for her. She had been wrong. The visits had been for Cecilia. Beautiful, bright, uncomplicated Cecilia, who was 2 years younger and 4 inches shorter, and who laughed easily and danced well, and who had never, in her 20 years of life, expressed a single opinion about tenant relations or estate management or anything more complex than which ribbon complemented her complexion. Cecilia, who entered rooms like sunlight and who made everyone she spoke to feel as though they were the most interesting person she had encountered that day. Cecilia, who had once asked Margaret why she read so many books about agriculture, and then, without waiting for the answer, had wandered off to practice a new piece on the pianoforte, her fingers moving over the keys with the effortless grace that characterized everything she did. Margaret loved her sister. This was the thing that made the situation unbearable rather than merely painful. If Cecilia had been cruel or petty, or the kind of sister who took things deliberately, Margaret could have retreated into righteous indignation and nursed her wound with the satisfying certainty that she had been wronged. But Cecilia had not taken the Duke from Margaret. Cecilia had simply been herself, warm and beautiful and easy to love, and the Duke had responded to that the way most people responded to Cecilia, which was with immediate and uncomplicated affection. The Duke had been sitting in Margaret's morning room, drinking Margaret's tea, discussing Margaret's preferred subjects, and all the while he had been looking at Cecilia. Margaret had not seen it. She had not seen it because she had been too busy being interesting and too busy being hopeful and too busy pouring tea to notice that the Duke's eyes, when they moved around the room during their conversations, always found Cecilia first, always paused on Cecilia's face, always returned to Cecilia's laugh the way a compass needle returns to north, not with effort, but with the quiet, inevitable certainty of something that has found the direction it was always going to point. "Margaret?" Cecilia's voice broke through the silence. "Are you not going to say anything?" Margaret looked at her sister. She looked at the sapphire on her sister's hand. She looked at the toast growing cold on the rack and the tea growing cold in the pot and the morning continuing around her as though nothing of significance had happened, when in fact everything of significance had happened, and she had somehow been the last person in her own house to know about it. "Congratulations," Margaret said. Her voice was steady. "I'm very happy for you." She picked up her teacup. She carried it to the table. She sat down across from her sister. She drank her tea. She ate her toast. She asked appropriate questions about the proposal. Was it romantic? Was the Duke nervous? Had Cecilia expected it? And she listened to the answers with the attentive composure of a woman who had spent her entire life learning to manage her expressions in rooms where her feelings were inconvenient. She did not cry. She did not leave the table. She did not do anything in that breakfast room that would give Cecilia or their mother or anyone else the slightest indication that Margaret Hartley had just had her heart broken by a sapphire ring on her sister's finger at 8 o'clock in the morning on a Tuesday in April. Their mother arrived at breakfast 20 minutes later in a state of barely contained excitement that suggested she had been informed of the engagement before Margaret. This was confirmed when she swept into the room, kissed Cecilia on both cheeks, and declared that the Duke of Ashworth was the finest match in the county, and that they must begin planning immediately, as a June wedding would require considerable preparation, and she intended the event to reflect the full significance of the alliance. "Margaret, you will help with the arrangements, of course," their mother said, turning to her elder daughter with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had already assigned roles in her head. "Cecilia will need guidance on household management before the wedding. You are the most capable person I know when it comes to domestic organization. The Duke will be fortunate to have you as a sister." Margaret set down her tea. "Of course, Mama," she said. "I'm happy to help." She excused herself after breakfast and went to her room. She closed the door. She sat on the edge of her bed, and she allowed herself, for the space of 5 minutes, to feel what she had been suppressing since the moment she saw the sapphire on Cecilia's finger. It was not anger. Margaret Hartley was not, by nature, an angry person. It was not jealousy exactly, though jealousy was part of it, the sharp, specific pain of watching something you wanted given to someone else. What it was, more than anything, was the profound, disorienting grief of a woman who had believed she was being seen and had discovered she was invisible. She had been in the room. She had been pouring the tea. She had been the one engaging the Duke in conversation, the one whose mind he seemed to value, the one whose company he seemed to seek. And none of it had mattered. None of it had been for her. She had been a comfortable chair in a room whose real attraction was the view from the window. 5 minutes. She allowed herself 5 minutes of sitting on the edge of her bed in the morning light, feeling the full weight of the humiliation and the loss and the particular cruelty of discovering that you are not the protagonist of a story you believed you were telling. And then she stood up. She washed her face. She changed into a walking dress. And she went downstairs to begin helping Cecilia plan a wedding to the man Margaret had been falling in love with for 3 weeks. The weeks that followed were an exercise in the kind of endurance that does not announce itself as heroic because it takes place in domestic spaces and involves decisions about table linens and flower arrangements rather than battles and last stands. Margaret organized the guest list because Cecilia did not know half the families in the county well enough to rank them by social precedence. Margaret corresponded with the vicar about the ceremony because Cecilia found the vicar's wife tedious and could not sustain a conversation with her for more than 4 minutes. Margaret consulted with the housekeeper about the wedding breakfast because Cecilia had never in her life thought about how many dishes constituted an appropriate meal for 200 guests. And Margaret, because she was Margaret, did all of this with efficiency and grace, and not a single outward indication that every letter she wrote and every arrangement she made was accompanied by the low, steady ache of wanting something she could not have. The Duke called regularly during this period. He came to Hartfield House 2 or 3 times a week, ostensibly to discuss wedding arrangements with Cecilia and her parents, but the conversations inevitably drifted. The Duke would sit in the morning room, Margaret's morning room, though she had stopped thinking of it that way, and Cecilia would talk brightly about dresses and guests and the color of the table flowers, and then there would be a pause, and the Duke would turn to Margaret and ask about the estate boundary dispute she had mentioned the previous week, or the new irrigation proposal she had been reading about, or whether she had finished the volume of Pope she had borrowed from his library. And Margaret would answer. She would answer because she could not help answering, because the questions were interesting, and because the Duke asked them with genuine curiosity, and because her mind, which was her greatest asset and her greatest liability, could not resist the opportunity to engage with someone who wanted to hear what she thought. These conversations were, she understood with painful clarity, the most intellectually stimulating interactions of her life. They were also the cruelest, because they confirmed what she already knew, that the Duke valued her mind, respected her opinions, sought her conversation, and had chosen, despite all of this, to marry her sister. He had chosen beauty over brilliance. He had chosen ease over engagement. He had chosen the woman who laughed at his jokes over the woman who challenged his thinking. And Margaret could not even blame him for it, because Cecilia was not merely beautiful, she was kind and warm and genuine in her affections. And if she did not possess Margaret's intellectual depth, she possessed something that Margaret, for all her reading and her thinking and her careful management of everything, had never managed to acquire. She possessed the ability to make people feel comfortable, to make them feel seen, to make them feel, in her presence, that they were enough. Margaret made people feel challenged, interesting perhaps, stimulated, but not comfortable, never comfortable. And comfort, she was learning, was what most people, even most dukes, wanted more than anything else. The crisis came 6 weeks before the wedding. Margaret was in the morning room, alone, reviewing the seating arrangements for the wedding breakfast, when she heard the front door open. It was 9:30 in the evening. Cecilia was at a musical evening at the Dewhursts' house. Her parents had retired early. No visitors were expected. Margaret went to the hallway. The Duke of Ashworth was standing in the entrance, and he looked as though he had not slept. His coat was damp, it had been raining steadily since mid-afternoon, and his cravat was loose, and his hair was disordered in a way that suggested he had been running his hands through it repeatedly, which was a habit Margaret had observed during their conversations, when he was wrestling with a thought he could not quite articulate. "Your Grace," Margaret said, "it is 9:30. "I know," he said. "Is it? I need to speak with you." "Cecilia is at the Dewhursts." "I know," he said again. "I'm not here to speak with Cecilia." Margaret looked at him. She looked at the rain on his coat and the disorder of his hair and the expression on his face, which was not the expression of a man paying a social call, but the expression of a man who had arrived at a conclusion he did not know what to do with. She looked past him, through the open door, at the dark drive, and saw his horse tied loosely to the gatepost. The animal was wet through. It had been standing for some time. Which meant the Duke had been standing for some time outside her door in the rain, trying to decide whether to knock. She thought about closing the door. She thought about telling him to leave, that it was improper, that whatever he needed to say could wait until morning, when Cecilia would be present, and propriety would be maintained, and Margaret would have time to arrange her face into the appropriate expression of polite interest. She thought about all of this in the space of 3 seconds, and then she stepped aside because she had spent 6 weeks watching this man drink her tea and talk to her mind and marry her sister, and she deserved, at the very least, to hear what he had come to say. "You had better come in," she said. They sat in the morning room. Margaret did not pour tea. She did not light additional candles. She sat in her usual chair, and he sat in his usual chair, and the room was dim and quiet, and stripped of all the social apparatus that normally governed their interactions. "I have made a mistake," the Duke said. He said it without preamble, without the careful diplomatic framing he usually employed when approaching difficult subjects. He said it the way a man says something he has been thinking for weeks and has finally run out of reasons not to say aloud. "A mistake," Margaret repeated. "I proposed to the wrong sister." The words landed in the quiet room like stones dropped into deep water. Margaret heard them. She processed them. She sat very still in her chair and felt the full, devastating weight of them settle into her chest, and she did not move, and she did not speak, because she did not trust herself to do either without breaking. "Margaret," the Duke said, His voice was rough. I have been coming to this house for 2 months. I have been sitting in this room. I have been talking to you about Pope and Cowper and irrigation and tenant disputes and boundary law. I have been thinking about you when I leave. I've been looking forward to coming back, not because Cecilia is here, but because you are here. He stopped, started again. I proposed to Cecilia because she is beautiful, and because she is kind, and because I thought that was what a sensible man did. He married the woman who was beautiful and kind, and who would make his life pleasant. I thought that was enough. I thought the conversations I had with you were incidental, enjoyable, but incidental. The way one enjoys a particularly good wine at dinner without deciding to build one's life around it. He looked at her. His eyes were red-rimmed. He had not slept. He had, she realized, been outside her house for some time before he knocked. He had been standing in the rain, trying to decide whether to come in. He had been at her door all night. But they are not incidental, he said. They are the only conversations I have ever had that make me feel like I am thinking clearly. You are the only person I have ever met who makes me feel like my mind is being used for its actual purpose rather than for the performance of being a duke. And I have spent the past 6 weeks watching you plan my wedding to your sister with more competence and intelligence and quiet, devastating grace than any person should be required to demonstrate, and I have understood, slowly and with considerable self-reproach, that I have done something unforgivable. Margaret's hands were gripped in her lap so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. She could feel her composure, the composure she had been maintaining for 6 weeks, for 24 years, for her entire life, beginning to fracture in a way that was not controlled and not manageable, and not the kind of fracture she could repair with 5 minutes of sitting on the edge of her bed. "What you have done," she said, and her voice came out steady, which was a miracle of will that she would be proud of later, "is proposed to my sister. You have asked her to marry you. She has accepted. She loves you, or believes she does, which amounts to the same thing at her age. Our mother has planned the wedding. 200 guests have been invited. The church has been booked. And you are sitting in my morning room at 9:30 in the evening, telling me that you have made a mistake." "Yes," the Duke said. "That is what I am doing." "Then you must unmake it," Margaret said. "I cannot," the Duke said. "If I break the engagement, I will humiliate Cecilia. I will damage her reputation. I will cause a scandal that will follow your family for years." "Then you cannot sit here and tell me this," Margaret said. Her voice cracked. It was the first crack, the first visible evidence of the fracture, and she watched the Duke's face change when he heard it, watched him register for the first time the full scope of what he was doing to her. "You cannot sit in my morning room and tell me that you love my mind and my conversation and my quiet, devastating grace while wearing the ring you gave my sister on a chain around your conscience. You cannot give me this and expect me to manage it the way I have managed everything else. I am not that strong, Your Grace. No one is that strong." The Duke leaned forward. His hands were clasped between his knees, and she could see that his knuckles were white, and she understood that this conversation was costing him something too. But she could not, in that moment, find it in herself to care about what it was costing him, because the cost to her was so much greater. He had the luxury of choosing. She had only ever had the luxury of being unchosen. "Margaret, I need you to understand." "I understand perfectly," she said. "You are telling me that you feel something for me. You're telling me this in my own house at night, while my sister, your fiancée, is at a musical evening wearing the ring you put on her finger. You are telling me this because you need me to know, because the knowledge has become too heavy for you to carry alone, and so you have brought it here, to me, so that I can help you carry it, because that is what I do." She was standing now, though she did not remember standing. "Do you know what I did this morning?" she said. Her voice was no longer steady. "I finalized the menu for your wedding breakfast. I selected the flowers for the church. I wrote to your housekeeper about the arrangement of the guest rooms at Ashworth Park. I have been building your life with my sister for 6 weeks, and I have done it with competence and care, and not a single word of complaint, because that is what I do. I manage, I organize, I make things work. And now you are asking me to manage this as well, your guilt, your revelation, your inconvenient discovery that the woman you find interesting is not the woman you propose to." She stood up. "I will not do it." The Duke stood as well. "I am not asking you to manage anything. I'm asking you to tell me what to do." "What to do?" Margaret stared at him. "You are a duke. You're 31 years old. You have managed 3 estates and a seat in Parliament, and you are asking me, the woman whose heart you broke over breakfast 6 weeks ago without even knowing you were doing it, to tell you what to do?" "Yes," he said, "because you are the only person I trust to give me an honest answer." The silence that followed was long. It was the silence of two people standing in a dimly lit room at the end of a day that had changed everything, trying to find a way forward through a situation that had no good options, only less terrible ones. Margaret walked to the window. She looked out at the dark garden, the garden where he'd proposed to Cecilia, where the sundial stood like a witness to a promise made to the wrong person. "You will marry Cecilia," Margaret said. Her voice was quiet now, controlled. The fracture had been sealed, temporarily, by the force of her will. "You will marry her, because you gave your word, and because she loves you, and because breaking the engagement would destroy her in a way that neither of us is willing to be responsible for." "And what about you?" the Duke asked. "What about what you feel is not my responsibility," Margaret said. She turned from the window. "What you feel is yours. You will carry it. You will manage it. And you will be a good husband to my sister, because she deserves a good husband, and because the alternative, a husband who is present in body and absent in mind, who is thinking about another woman while sitting across from his wife at breakfast, is a cruelty I will not permit you to inflict on her." She walked to the door. "You should go, Your Grace. Cecilia will be home soon." The Duke did not move. "Margaret, go." He went. He walked past her in the doorway, close enough that she could smell the rain on his coat and the particular scent of his soap, and she did not step back, and she did not look away, and she did not give him anything, not a touch, not a softening, not a single indication that what she was doing cost her anything at all. The front door closed behind him. Margaret stood in the hallway listening to his footsteps on the gravel drive, and then the sound of his horse, and then silence. She went upstairs. She sat on the edge of her bed. And this time, she did not limit herself to 5 minutes. The Duke of Ashworth married Cecilia Hartley in June, as planned. The wedding was beautiful. The flowers were perfect. The seating arrangements were impeccable. Margaret had managed every detail with her customary precision, and on the morning of the wedding, she helped Cecilia into her dress, white silk with seed pearls along the bodice, and adjusted her veil, and told her she looked beautiful, and meant it completely. She stood in the church in a dress of dove gray and watched her sister marry the man she loved, and she smiled when it was appropriate to smile, and she looked happy when it was appropriate to look happy. During the ceremony, the Duke's eyes found hers exactly once. It was during the vows, during the words about honor and devotion and forsaking all others, and the look lasted perhaps 2 seconds, and in those 2 seconds, Margaret saw everything he had told her in the morning room confirmed in his face. She held his gaze. She did not flinch. And then she looked away, and he looked at Cecilia, and the moment passed, and the vows were completed, and the ring, a different ring, a gold band, not the sapphire, was placed on Cecilia's finger, and it was done. At the wedding breakfast, Margaret sat beside the vicar's wife and discussed the new hymnals with genuine interest. She danced with the groom's cousin, a pleasant man with large ears who told her about his collection of geological specimens. She made a toast to the couple that was warm and witty, and that made Cecilia cry, and that made the Duke look at his plate. And then she went home. She went home to Hartfield House, which was quieter now with Cecilia gone. She went home to the morning room where the Duke's chair sat empty. She went home to the life she had been living before the Duke had arrived and disrupted it, and she resumed that life with the same competence and efficiency she brought to everything, because that was what Margaret Hartley did. She managed. 3 months after the wedding, Margaret received a letter. It was from a Mrs. Elizabeth Caldwell, a woman she had met briefly at the wedding, who ran a small school for girls in Bath. Mrs. Caldwell had been impressed by Margaret's organizational abilities and her evident intelligence, and she was writing to ask whether Margaret might consider a position as the school's administrator. The salary was modest. The work would be demanding, and it would require Margaret to leave Hartfield House and live independently in Bath, which was something no unmarried woman of her class was expected to do, and which her mother would almost certainly oppose. Margaret read the letter twice. She thought about the morning room. She thought about the empty chair. She thought about the next 40 years of her life spent managing her parents' household, attending her sister's dinner parties, watching the Duke across the table, and knowing what she knew and carrying what she carried. She wrote back to Mrs. Caldwell the same afternoon. She accepted. Her mother objected strenuously. She called it inappropriate, impractical, and entirely beneath a woman of Margaret's breeding. She asked what people would think. She asked what Margaret's prospects would be, as if Margaret's prospects at 24, unmarried and living in her parents' house in the shadow of her younger sister's brilliant match, were anything other than a slow, comfortable diminishment into the role of useful maiden aunt. Her father, who was quieter than his wife but considerably more observant, did not object. He waited until Margaret's mother had exhausted her arguments and retired to her room with a headache. And then he looked at Margaret across the dinner table with the expression of a man who had been watching his elder daughter carefully for 6 weeks, and who had drawn his own conclusions about the Duke of Ashworth's visits and the particular quality of Margaret's composure at the wedding and the way she had not cried, not once, through any of it. "I think Bath will suit you very well, my dear," he said. He said it with the careful gentleness of a man who had, perhaps, noticed more than Margaret had given him credit for. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his briefly. "You have been brave," he said. "I do not think anyone in this house has been sufficiently aware of how brave." Margaret looked at her father. She opened her mouth to say something. She was not sure what. Perhaps thank you. Perhaps I am not brave. Perhaps I am simply very tired of being the person who manages everything. But what came out instead was a sound that was not quite a word, and her father squeezed her hand, and they sat in the dining room in silence until the candles burned low. Margaret moved to Bath in October. She took up her position at Mrs. Caldwell's school. She discovered, within the first month, that she had a gift for teaching, not in the classroom, which she left to the tutors, but in the broader work of shaping a curriculum, managing staff, creating an environment in which girls were encouraged to think as well as to embroider. The school grew under her management. Enrollment doubled within 2 years. Margaret introduced classes in mathematics and natural philosophy alongside the traditional subjects, and when parents objected, she met with them personally and explained with the same calm, logical precision she had once used to discuss irrigation with the Duke why their daughters' minds deserved the same cultivation as their manners. She was good at this. She was, in fact, exceptional at it. The girls responded to her with a mixture of respect and genuine affection that surprised her, because she had always believed that her manner, direct, intellectual, unyielding in her expectations, would intimidate rather than inspire. But it turned out that girls who had spent their entire lives being told to be decorative and agreeable were hungry for someone who expected them to be capable and thoughtful instead. They sought her out. They asked her questions about mathematics and science and history, not because they were required to, but because they wanted to understand. And Margaret answered every question with the same serious attention she had once given to conversations about Pope and Cowper in a morning room in Hertfordshire. She made friends, not the polite, surface-level friendships of county society, but genuine connections with women who valued her mind and her company, and who did not find her intensity exhausting but invigorating. Mrs. Caldwell became a confidant. Miss Jameson, the mathematics tutor, became a walking companion. And Margaret discovered, to her considerable surprise, that she was capable of being comfortable, of making other people comfortable, when she was in an environment that valued what she had to offer rather than wishing she would offer something else. And in the work of building something that mattered, something that was hers, that bore the stamp of her intelligence and her will, she found a kind of fulfillment that was different from love, but no less real. The Duke and Cecilia visited once during their second year of marriage. Cecilia was pregnant with their first child, glowing with the particular radiance of a woman whose life had unfolded exactly as she had hoped. The Duke was attentive and kind, and clearly devoted to his wife, and when he greeted Margaret in the school's parlor, his expression was carefully pleasant and revealed nothing. They talked about the school. They talked about the baby. They did not talk about the morning room, or the rain-soaked evening, or the conversation that had taken place in the dark. But when Cecilia excused herself to use the retiring room, and Margaret and the Duke were alone for 30 seconds, he said very quietly, "You were right." "About what?" Margaret asked. "About everything." A pause. "I'm a good husband to her. I try every day." "I know," Margaret said. "She tells me in her letters." "And you?" he asked. His voice was careful. "Are you I'm exactly where I should be, Margaret said, and she meant it, not without sadness, not without the low, persistent ache that she suspected would be with her, in some form, for the rest of her life, but with the clarity of a woman who had looked at her options, love without partnership or purpose without love, and had chosen the one she could build a life on. The Duke nodded. Cecilia returned. They finished their tea. They left, and Margaret went back to her office, where the enrollment figures for the autumn term were waiting, and the applications from 3 new tutors needed reviewing, and the letter from a father in Bristol who wanted to know whether his daughter could study Latin as well as French required a response. She picked up her pen. She began to write. The work was good. The work was hers. And in the particular satisfaction of building something that would outlast her, Margaret Hartley found, if not happiness exactly, then something close to it, something steady and useful and entirely her own. Some women, she had learned, were not the protagonists of love stories. Some women were the protagonists of other kinds of stories, stories about work and will and the quiet, relentless refusal to be diminished by disappointment. Those stories were less romantic. They did not end with sapphire rings and moonlit proposals in gardens. But they were, Margaret thought, as she looked up from her desk at the school she had built, no less valuable for their quietness, and no less brave.